He was the most wanted outlaw in the Arizona Territory. She was the schoolteacher who agreed to marry him without ever knowing his name was printed on wanted posters across the frontier. In 1878, in a dusty town called Redemption Creek, a quiet cowboy named Jake Morgan counted down the days to his wedding, believing his past was buried as deep as the guns beneath his floorboards. But the past does not stay buried in the West. When the man he betrayed walked out of a territorial prison and rode toward everything Jake loved, the bride became the target. This is the story of an outlaw's last ride, and of a love strong enough to bring a broken man all the way back from the dead. Stay to the end. The Arizona Territory in 1878 was a land that asked no questions and forgave no answers. 10 years had passed since the Transcontinental Railroad stitched the country together. But out here, in the high desert between the Mogollon Rim and the border country, the law was still measured in days of hard riding, and a man could become whoever he claimed to be, so long as nobody arrived to say otherwise. Silver had been pulled out of the hills near Globe. Cattle outfits pushed their herds along the trails toward the railheads, and the Apache Wars still smoldered in the mountains to the east. It was a country full of men running from something. Most of them ran badly. One of them, for 8 quiet years, had run well. The town of Redemption Creek sat in a shallow valley, where a thin ribbon of water came down from the pines and made the cottonwoods grow tall. It had a main street of packed dirt, a church with a bell brought all the way from St. Louis, a saloon that closed respectably early on Sundays, and a general store owned by a widower named Elias Whitmore, who sold everything from Arbuckle's coffee to bolts of calico and considered himself, not without reason, the moral backbone of the community. 200 souls, maybe a few more, when the cattle season brought drifters through. It was the kind of town the dime novels back east never wrote about, because nothing ever happened there. That was precisely why he had chosen it. The man the town knew as Jake Morgan ran a small horse ranch 3 miles out, up against the red rocks where the valley narrowed. He was somewhere past 30, lean the way men get when they have spent years eating out of saddlebags, with a face that had been handsome once and was now simply weathered, like good leather left in the sun. He broke horses gently, which the old-timers found strange and admirable. He paid his accounts at the store in full and on time. He spoke little, drank less, and never, not once in 8 years, wore a gun into town. The men of Redemption Creek respected him. The women considered him a mystery, and nobody, not the sheriff, not the preacher, not even the barber who had run his razor along that quiet throat 100 times, suspected that they had been living beside a ghost. Because Jake Morgan did not exist. The hands that gentled colts in the corral had once fanned the hammer of a Colt single-action army faster than most men could blink. The quiet neighbor who tipped his hat to the ladies outside the mercantile had a name that used to travel ahead of him like a smell of smoke, whispered in stage depots, and shouted in courtrooms from Tucson to Santa Fe. They had called him the Coyote. For 5 brutal years, he had ridden with the Callaway Gang, the most feared outfit of road agents and bank raiders in the territory, the men who took the Wells Fargo silver shipment outside Prescott in broad daylight and left 3 guards bleeding in the dust. The Coyote had been the gun of that outfit, its edge, the reason lawmen let the gang ride past rather than die stopping them. There was a time when the reward for him, dead or alive, would have bought a decent cattle ranch. That man was supposed to be gone. Jake had spent 8 years killing him slowly, the only way such a man can be killed, with early mornings and honest calluses and the smell of hay instead of gunpowder. He had buried the last of him in a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth, 2 guns and a long gray coat under the floorboards of the ranch house, and some nights he could almost believe the burial had taken. Then Sarah Whitmore had happened to him, and for the first time since the war, Jake Morgan began to want a future instead of merely escaping a past. She was the schoolteacher, Elias Whitmore's only daughter, 26 years old, in a territory where most women married at 17, or not at all. She had stayed unmarried not for lack of offers, but for lack of interest in the men who made them, and she ran her one-room schoolhouse with a firmness that made grown ranchers nervous at town meetings. She had dark hair she pinned up carelessly, ink stains on her fingers more often than not, and a way of looking at a person as if she were reading a page and had every intention of finishing it. The first time she spoke to Jake, outside her father's store on a morning in late spring, it was to inform him that his mare was better mannered than he was, since the mare at least made eye contact. He had laughed. He had not laughed in years, and the sound surprised him more than it surprised her. The courtship had been slow, careful, conducted in the open the way things had to be done in a town that small. He drove her to church socials in his buckboard. He repaired the schoolhouse roof before the autumn rains and refused payment, which scandalized her father into finally inviting him to Sunday dinner. She discovered that the Silent Horseman could recite passages of scripture and, more unexpectedly, poetry, though he would never say where a ranch hand had learned such things. He discovered that when she laughed, the tight, cold knot he had carried under his ribs since the Prescott Road loosened, just slightly, like a rope going slack. She did not push at his silences. She seemed to understand that some rooms in a man are closed, and she was patient enough to live in the rest of the house. He asked her to marry him in October, at the edge of his land, with the cottonwoods gone gold along the creek. He had planned to say a great many things, and managed almost none of them. She said yes before he finished. The wedding was set for 2 weeks before Christmas, at the church with the St. Louis Bell and Elias Whitmore, who had thawed toward the quiet rancher one Sunday dinner at a time, ordered white silk from Tucson for his daughter's dress, and told the men at the store, with the satisfaction of a merchant and the pride of a father, that his Sarah had found the one honest man left in the territory. And Jake let himself believe it. That was his mistake, and he knew it even as he made it, the way a man knows a horse is going to throw him a half second before it does. Happiness makes a man visible. For 8 years he had survived by being nobody, by keeping his eyes down and his name small. Now there was a wedding notice pinned to the board outside the Mercantile, with his name written on it in Sarah's own hand, and folks 3 towns over talking about the schoolteacher who had tamed the loneliest man in the valley. Light was falling on him, and light, in the desert, always casts a shadow. The shadow arrived on the noon stage from Maricopa on a cold Tuesday in the first week of December, 11 days before the wedding. The stranger who stepped down from the coach wore a black frock coat, gone gray at the seams, and he moved stiffly, like a man whose joints had learned the damp of a stone cell. His boots were new, his eyes were not. He signed the register at the boarding house with a name nobody in Redemption Creek recognized, paid for a week in advance with coin, and spent the afternoon on the porch of the saloon with a glass he barely touched, watching the street the way a rattlesnake watches a trail side, without hurry and without mercy. The bartender would say later that the man asked only pleasant questions about the town, about the country roundabout, about the horse ranches up the valley, and whether any were run by a tall fellow, quiet, who was good with a gun. Nobody thought anything of it. Strangers passed through. The stage brought them, and the stage took them away. In a territory where half the population had arrived running from a debt, a war record, or a woman, curiosity was considered poor manners, and Redemption Creek prided itself on its manners. The bartender answered the pleasant questions pleasantly. He even mentioned, because it was the happiest news the town had, that the quiet rancher up the valley was getting married to the schoolteacher come December, and that the whole county was invited. But that evening, as Jake drove his buckboard down the main street with lumber for the new corral, past the saloon with its lamps just lit against the early dark, the stranger rose from his chair on the porch. He did not call out. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply removed his hat, slow and courteous as an undertaker, and stood there in the yellow light where he could be seen, and waited. Jake felt the look before he found its source, the old animal instinct that 8 years of peace had dulled but never killed. He turned his head, across 40 feet of darkening street, past the wagon ruts and the hitching rails, his eyes met a face he had last seen through the bars of a Yuma-bound prison wagon, a face he had put there with his own sworn testimony, trading his old chief's freedom for his own neck when the choice had come down to the rope or the deal. A face that had shouted a promise at him over the rattle of chains that day. 9 years passed. A promise Jake had heard in his sleep every winter since. Silas Calloway smiled at him across the street of Redemption Creek, put his hat back on, and walked inside. The lumber never got unloaded that night. Jake sat in the buckboard in the dark outside his own ranch house for a long time, hands steady on the reins the way they were always steady, while everything inside him came apart and reassembled into something older and colder. Yuma Territorial Prison held men in cells blasted out of rock, and it did not open its gates early for men like Silas, which meant he had not been released. He had gotten out, and a man who breaks out of Yuma and rides 500 miles to stand on a porch and take off his hat is not a man who has come to talk. Jake looked at the lamplight in his window, at the small, warm life he had built, one careful year at a time, and understood with perfect, sickening clarity that Silas hadn't come to kill him. Killing him would be quick, and Silas Calloway had never once in his life done a cruel thing quickly. He had come to study him first, to find what the coyote loved. And 11 days before her wedding, Sarah Whitmore was sewing white silk by her window, in a house with no lock worth the name, in a town that had no idea what was sleeping in its boarding house bed. For 3 days, nothing happened. That was the worst of it. Jake rode into town each morning on invented errands, watching the boarding house, watching the stage road, watching the faces of strangers loading feed sacks at the depot. Silas Calloway sat on the saloon porch in the thin December sun, drank his coffee, tipped his hat to the ladies, and did absolutely nothing, with the patience of a man who had spent 9 years in a stone cell, learning exactly how much time was worth. Twice their eyes met across the street. Twice the older man smiled, that same unhurried smile, and looked away. He wasn't hiding. He wanted to be seen. Every hour of his idleness was a message written in a language only one man in Redemption Creek could read. I know what you have. I'm deciding when to take it. Jake thought about running. He lay awake beside the thought at night and turned it over like a coin. Saddle 2 horses. Wake Sarah before dawn. Tell her everything on the trail, and pray she still loved whatever man was left when the telling was done. But she had a father in this town, and children who read their first words in her schoolhouse, and a life she had built with her own 2 ink-stained hands. And the truth, the cold central truth he could not ride around, was that there was no distance that would matter. He had spent 5 years watching Silas Calloway hunt men. The chief never lost a trail. He simply arrived, sooner or later, the way winter arrives. Running would only mean Sarah died, tired. He thought about killing him. God forgive him. He thought about it in detail. In the old grammar he had spent 8 years unlearning. A rifle from the rocks above the stage road. A knife in the dark of the boarding house. But Silas had ridden into town alone, and that fact whispered its own warning. The Calloway gang had numbered 11 men when the territorial court broke it. 4 had died since, 2 at the end of ropes in Prescott. That left men unaccounted for, and a chief who never, in all his years of outlawry, walked into a place without another door already open behind him. If Silas died in Redemption Creek, whatever waited out in the dark would come in, and it would not be patient. So Jake did the hardest thing a fighting man can do. He waited, and he watched, and he kept the woman he loved inside the circle of his sight. He invented reasons to be near the schoolhouse at closing time. He told Sarah, with a casualness that cost him more than she would ever know, that a rancher had seen a cougar near the creek trail, and that she was not to walk out to the ranch alone anymore. She looked at him a moment too long when he said it, the way she looked at a boy whose excuse for missing lessons did not quite hold together. But she nodded. Later, she would remember that look, and the shadow behind his eyes, and understand it was the first time her quiet cowboy had ever lied to her. On the 4th day, the stage brought a crate of goods for the mercantile, and took Silas Calloway away on its outbound run, south toward Maricopa. Jake watched the coach shrink into the winter haze and did not feel 1 ounce of relief. A wolf leaving a pasture in plain sight is not a wolf giving up. It is a wolf that has finished counting the sheep. He was right. The blow fell on the 8th day, a Saturday, with the wedding 1 week away. Sarah had spent the morning in the house behind the store, hemming the white silk dress by the front window, while her father minded the counter. Neighbors saw her there as late as 11, her dark head bent over the bright fabric, the very picture the town would keep of her afterward, like a photograph nobody had thought to take. At noon, Elias Whitmore walked back for his dinner and found the door standing open to the cold. A chair was overturned. The dress lay across the floor with a boot print of red desert clay stamped on the white silk like a brand. His daughter was gone. There had been 3 of them, near as the tracks could tell, come in on horseback through the alley behind the church, while the town's attention was on Market Saturday. They had taken her west, toward the broken country beyond the valley, riding hard. And on the table, weighted down with a cartridge, standing on its end, like a little brass tombstone, they had left a single sheet of paper, written in a schooled, elegant, terrible hand. You took everything from me. 9 years in a stone box, 1 word at a time. Now I take yours. Come and get her, Coyote. Come alone, come armed, and come being the man I made, because that is the only man who will ever see her alive. Estoy. Elias Whitmore read the note 4 times before the words would arrange themselves into sense, and even then they made a sense he could not enter. Coyote. He was still holding it, gray-faced among his shelves of coffee and calico, when the man his daughter was to marry came through the door at a dead run. Summoned by the church bell, somebody had begun to ring. What happened in the next hour would be told in Redemption Creek for a generation. They gathered in the store, the way small towns gather around a wound, and Sheriff Amos Dawson read the note aloud before Jake could stop him. The name landed in the room like a dropped horseshoe. Coyote. Older men went still. A drummer from Tucson actually stepped backward, and every eye in that crowded room turned by degrees toward the tall, quiet rancher standing whitely by the door, and watched him not deny it. He could have lied. Some part of him, the part that had survived on lies for years, offered him a dozen of them ready-made. Instead, Jake Morgan stood in the middle of the town that had given him a second life, and, in a low, steady voice, gave it back. He told them what he had been. He told them about the Calloway gang and the Prescott Road, about the silver and the blood, about the deal he had struck with the territorial prosecutor, his testimony for his life, and how he had ridden away from that courtroom in Santa Fe as a free man with a dead man's future. He told them he had come to their valley to bury the coyote, and that he had believed, God help him, that the grave would hold. He did not look at anyone while he spoke except Elias Whitmore, and when it was finished, he took the note from the old man's hand, gently, and said the only thing left to say, I am going to bring her back. And then, because owed truth is owed whole, he added the rest of it, or I am going to die closer to her than this. The room found its voice all at once. Shock, fury, fear. A church deacon called him a viper in God's garden. A cattleman demanded the sheriff arrest him on the spot. And Sheriff Dawson, a heavy, careful man who had kept the peace for a decade, chiefly because there had been no war, looked at the note and at the name at the bottom of it, and did the arithmetic of his own courage in front of everyone. He would wire the county seat, he said. He would request marshals, maybe soldiers from Fort McDowell. It would take days, someone said. The Calloway gang, someone else said. And the name did its old work even now. Dawson's eyes would not come up off the floorboards. A posse of shopkeepers against Silas Calloway and the Rocks, he said, would be a funeral procession that saddled its own horses. He was not wrong, and it did not matter. Every man in the room understood what they were watching. The law of the territory, measured and found small. Somewhere west of the valley, in the failing light of that same afternoon, Sarah Whitmore rode with her wrists bound to a saddle horn, surrounded by men who smelled of wood smoke and old violence, and did what she had done all her life when the world turned senseless. She paid attention. She noted the landmarks as they passed them, the twin red buttes, the dry wash running north, the way the oldest rider favored his left side, where a lawman's bullet had found him some year long past. She heard them call their chief by name, and understood, piece by piece, whose war she had been carried into, and what the man she loved must once have been for such men to hate him so carefully. She was afraid, more afraid than she had ever been. But fear, she discovered, was like a cold schoolroom in January. You did not wait for it to warm. You worked in it. It was Elias Whitmore who ended it. The old merchant crossed the silent room to the man who had deceived him at 100 Sunday dinners, the outlaw who had asked for his daughter's hand with a murderer's hands, and looked at him a long time. Then he said, loud enough for the room, that he had sold goods to liars all his life, and had learned one thing. What a man was could be found in his ledger, but what a man is, you learn only when the account comes due. He picked up Jake's hat from the counter and held it out. Bring my girl home, he said, whatever your name is. Jake rode out of Redemption Creek alone that afternoon, without one man of the county at his back, exactly as his enemy had written it, exactly as his enemy wanted. The town watched him go from doorways and windows, the way people watch weather they cannot vote on. At the ranch, in the last gray light, he pried up the floorboards he had nailed down 8 years before and lifted out a long wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the table where he and Sarah had planned a wedding and stood over it a moment with his hands flat on the lid, like a man at a coffin, which in every way that mattered is what it was. Then he opened it, and the past looked up at him, oiled and patient, wrapped in 9 years of silence. He dressed by lamplight in the long gray coat, and it settled onto his shoulders with a familiarity that frightened him more than any gun ever had. He buckled the twin holsters and tied them down, and his hands remembered the knots without being asked, the way a man's tongue remembers a language he swore he had forgotten. In the window glass, in the dark, a stranger looked back at him wearing a dead man's face, and Jake stood very still before it and made the only bargain left to make. He would let the coyote out. He would ride him like a borrowed horse into the worst country of his life. And when Sarah was safe, whatever it cost, he would put him back in the ground. He blew out the lamp, and the coyote came home. The country west of Redemption Creek was the kind of land the Spanish had crossed and kept crossing. A maze of red rock canyons, black malpais, and dry washes that ran nowhere and changed their minds in flood season. It was land that hid men well, which is why the old gangs had loved it, and it hid trails badly to anyone who knew how to look, which is why the old gangs had feared anyone who could. 3 horses carrying riders, and one carrying double-leaf sign, no rain had come to wash away. Bruised grass, a nicked hoofprint with a distinctive bar shoe, the cold ash of a fire built small and smart. Jake read it all at a long trot, barely leaning from the saddle, and the 8 missing years might never have happened at all. He had been the best tracker in the Calloway outfit, better than the half-Comanche scout they had ridden with in the early days, and Silas knew it. That was the poisoned heart of the invitation. The trail was not hidden, because his old chief wanted him to follow it, wanted him coming on hard through country of Silas's choosing, past ambush points of Silas's choosing, arriving at last with his horse worn down, his canteen light, and his fear ripened to full weight. Jake knew he was riding down the barrel of a gun laid patiently across 9 years. He rode anyway, but he did not ride it the way the coyote of old would have, all speed and fury. He rode it the way the man Sarah loved had learned to break horses. Slow where slow was safe, and never once where he was expected. The first lookout was waiting at the mouth of a canyon called by the Mexicans La Boca del Lobo, the mouth of the wolf. A lookout wedged into the rocks with a repeating rifle and a bottle he should not have brought. Jake left his horse a mile back, came over the ridge barefoot in the freezing dark, with his boots hung around his neck, and took the man from behind with an arm across the throat. Quiet as snowfall, he tied him with his own belt and set him against a rock, and then he crouched in front of him and let the man get a good long look at the gray coat and the twin tied-down holsters, and watched 9 years of campfire stories do his work for him. The lookout was young, one of the new men Silas had gathered like carrion birds on the ride north from Yuma. He talked. They always talked. The old silver mine, he said. The Perdita workings, 3 canyons west, where the company had given up on the vein in '71 and left the shafts standing open like graves. 8 men, maybe 9, and the woman, yes, unhurt. The chief had given orders that she was not to be touched, the young man said. And then, with the drink and the fear loosening him past all wisdom, he added what the orders were for. The chief was keeping her for a wedding. Jake went very still in the darkness for a moment, and the young lookout saw something come into the tracker's face that made him begin, softly, to pray. He left the man trussed and alive by his own cold fire, because the man Sarah loved did not kill helpless men, and every mile of this ride was now a war over exactly that. But he took the rifle, and the horse, and the knowledge, and he rode west, under a sky salted with winter stars, doing the arithmetic he had once been famous for. 8 guns, maybe 9, in fixed positions around a mine head they knew, and he did not. The odds were beyond foolish. They were the kind of odds that had made him leave the life in the first place, the night after Prescott, when he had understood at last that the ledger of his years held nothing on the credit side but luck, and that luck is the one horse that always throws its rider. He rode through country that remembered him. He watered the horses at a seep spring only 4 living men knew, under an overhang where someone, some season of the lost years, had scratched a coyote into the rock with a knife point, and he sat his saddle a moment looking at it, a man reading his own headstone. He passed the burned station at Aguirre Wells, where the gang had wintered in '72, its adobe walls melted to shoulder height, its corral posts standing like grave markers, and the memories came whether he consented to them or not. Silas teaching him to read sign by firelight, patient as a schoolmaster. Silas splitting the Prescott silver share and share alike, fair as a deacon, and then shooting a man 2 days later for holding back a watch. That had always been the riddle of the chief, the thing that made him more dangerous than any mere killer. He was loyal and generous, and even kind, right up until the ledger of his grievances tipped, and then he was an avalanche wearing a hat. Jake had not betrayed a monster 9 years ago. He had betrayed a man who had been, in the broken currency of that life, his brother and his father both. That was the debt. That was why no distance would ever have been far enough. A second lookout watched the high trail into the Perdita canyons, from a shelf of rock, with a bell mare picketed below, to whinny at strange horses. Jake found the mare first, muzzled her with his coat sleeve, and worked up the scree in the last dark before moonrise. This one did not surrender quietly, and the fight in the rocks was short and ugly, and ended with the sentry alive but wishing otherwise, his shoulder out of its socket, and his warning unfired. 2 eyes gone from the wolf's head. It was almost dawn, and here, on the cold shelf above the canyons, with the mine head at last in view 2 miles distant, its old head frame black against the graying sky, and its fires burning small and confident, Jake Morgan made his mistake. He saw the camp waking. He saw a small figure in a dark dress, led from the mine, mouth to the fire, hands bound before her, head high, and the sight of her, alive, whole, 70 hours into his terror, and 2 miles from his hand, unstitched every careful thing in him. The coyote would have waited for the following night, would have spent a day flat on that ridge counting guns and learning the water and the ground. The man who loved Sarah Whitmore saw a 3rd Century's relief rider coming up the trail below him a half hour early, with the light coming on, and no time and her right there, and he chose speed over craft, for the first time in the whole long ride. He took the relief rider clean, but the man's horse bolted, riderless, straight down the canyon into the waking camp, stirrups flapping like a fire bell that ran on 4 legs. There is no alarm in the world quite so eloquent as an empty saddle. What followed was a running fight through the boulder fields in the half-light. One man against a camp turned hornet nest, and for a few savage minutes, the old stories about the coyote were all true at once. 2 of Silas's new men learned in the space of a single drawn breath why the reward posters had once said dead or alive, as if the first word were a kindness. But numbers are numbers, and ground is ground. They pinned him in a dry wash with a crossfire from the rim. Patient, professional, no wasted lead, hurting rather than killing. And Jake understood, even as he fought, that killing had never been the plan. The voice, when it finally came down into the wash, was the one he had heard in his sleep for 9 winters, unhurried and almost gentle. The voice of a man who had rehearsed this morning through 3,000 nights in a stone box. "Put them down, Coyote," the voice said. "You have my word. She watches you die old and gray, or she watches you die today. Those are the only 2 weddings on offer." They took his guns and his knife, and the little folding photograph of Sarah he carried in his shirt, which Silas examined with the tenderness of a collector before putting it in his own pocket. A small theft more obscene than any violence. They bound his arms behind a timber post at the mine head in full view of the fire, and for the first time in 9 years, the 2 men who had once been the terror of the territory looked at each other with nothing between them but air and ruin. Silas had aged the way iron ages, no softer, only darker. He crouched before his prisoner and studied him a long while, and when he finally spoke, it was without theater, which made it worse. "You gave me to them with words," he said, "in a courtroom, in a collar and tie. So I am not going to shoot you, brother. I am going to marry your girl in front of you. With the words, all the proper words, and then you and I will finally be even in the coin you paid me in." Sarah had spent 2 days in that camp, doing what she did in any unruly classroom, watching, sorting, learning the room. She had learned that the new men feared Silas rather than loved him, which meant they wouldn't die for him 1 second longer than a fight looked winnable. She had learned that the cook was half deaf, that the guard on the mine mouth left his post each evening when the coffee boiled, because 9 years in prison had taught his chief punctuality, and the whole camp had caught it like a fever. She had learned that the woman they had all been ordered not to touch could move about the fire circle with a coffee pot, nearly unwatched, because men who will not look at a woman soon stop seeing her, and a person a camp does not see is a person the camp cannot stop. She had no gun and no knife and no illusions. What she had was a teacher's inventory of every flammable, breakable, and spillable object between the cook fire and the powder shed, and a bound man's certainty that the person they had brought here as bait had somehow become the only free actor on the field. Across the camp, she stood bound by the fire now, close enough to hear all of it. Her eyes found Jake's over the flames, over the guns, over the wreck of every safe and gentle thing they had planned, and what passed between them in that look was not despair. He saw her fear, yes, but under it, steady as a lamp in a window, he saw the school teacher who had never once in her life waited for a room to warm before she went to work. Her eyes moved, once, deliberately, toward the cook fire and the tin of lamp oil beside it, and then came back to him, and one eyebrow rose, very slightly, in a question, and bound to a post at the bottom of his life, Jake Morgan almost smiled. Silas chose the evening for his ceremony, because cruelty, like theater, understands lighting. Through the short winter afternoon, the camp made its grotesque preparations, and the chief himself shaved at a steel mirror hung on the head frame, unhurried, while his prisoner watched from the post, and the sun went down the sky, 1 degree of mockery at a time. One of the new men had been a circuit preacher once, before whiskey and warrants, and he stood by the fire with an actual Bible, sweating in the cold, understanding at last, and far too late, what kind of outfit he had joined. The old hands drank little and watched the dark. The new ones drank more and watched the woman. And the woman, bound at the wrists and dressed in the dark schoolteacher's dress they had taken her in, asked in a small, defeated voice whether she might at least warm herself and stir the fire and heat water, seeing as it was to be, after a fashion, her wedding night. Silas, shaving, amused, king of the one small kingdom he had ever wanted, allowed it. It was the last order he ever gave that was obeyed. What the camp saw was a beaten bride shuffling between the cook fire and the supply boxes. What was actually occurring was a methodical woman executing an inventory she had spent 2 days compiling. The tin of lamp oil went into the stew pot's shadow. The stew pot went to the edge of the flames. A knot of rag, soaked and ready, disappeared into her bound hands, and her bound hands passed near the coals as she stumbled. So clumsy, so harmless, and did not come away empty. When she finally straightened by the powder shed at the mine mouth, with the whole camp's eyes on the shaving mirror, where their chief was scraping the last lather from his jaw, Sarah Whitmore, teacher of Redemption Creek's children, said clearly into the dusk the one word she had been saving all day. Fire. The lamp oil took the cook fire and stood it up into a pillar. The pillar took the grease of the stew and became a roar. Burning tinder, flung two-handed by a woman nobody was watching, landed against the powder shed's door, and the camp of Silas Calloway came apart into exactly the kind of night that eats disciplined men and swallows undisciplined ones whole. Horses screamed and tore their pickets. The half-deaf cook ran into the darkness bellowing about the powder, and every man who heard the word powder made his own instant private arrangement with geography. And in the first full second of the chaos, before any single mind in that camp had sorted flame from faint, the prisoner at the post was already moving, because he alone had been told what was coming, in a language of glances his enemy had never learned to read. Jake had spent the afternoon doing his own quiet work, flexing the rawhide at his wrists, a fraction at a time, against the angle iron of the old head frame, bolted to his post, patient as water. The bindings did not break. They had thinned, and terror is strength. With the fire standing up over the camp, and Sarah silhouetted against it, he tore his hands free, taking skin with the rawhide and never feeling it, and went through the scattering camp, low and fast, a gray ghost in the firelight, headed not away from the guns, but toward them. The guard by the tack pile died, half-turned, never fully understanding what came out of the light at him. And then the coyote had his own guns back, the worn grips finding his palms like old dogs coming home, and the mathematics of the Perdita mine changed forever. The fight in the burning camp was short, as real fights are. 2 of the new men tried him together by the corral, and were unequal to the year of his life this was. A third, the failed preacher, threw down his rifle and his Bible both, and ran for Mexico, and Jake let him go. The old hand with the bad shoulder was braver and steadier, and it did not help him. In the space of 40 breaths, the camp was dead men, empty saddles, and fire. And Jake came around the powder shed calling her name, and she was there, alive, singed, magnificent, sawing her wrist bindings on a broken shovel blade. And for one heartbeat, in the middle of the inferno, they looked at each other, and the wedding that mattered happened right there, without preacher or bell, in a single glance that said everything either of them would ever need signed. Then the mine mouth spoke behind them. One shot, deliberate, and the shovel blade rang like a struck bell and went spinning, and the voice came out of the smoke, conversational as ever. "You always did like fire, Coyote," it said. "Bring her dowry and come out where I can see you." Silas was waiting in the open ground before the mine, where the dawn was just beginning to gray the smoke, and he had stopped pretending to be anything but what 9 years in stone had made him. The two men faced each other at 30 paces in the ruin of the camp, the way the whole territory had once been certain they someday would. And it must be told truly, Jake did not want to draw. Not out of fear, out of grief. Under the gray coat, at the bottom of everything, his old chief was the last living piece of the man he had been, and killing him would be a kind of suicide that succeeded. His hand hung open above the worn grip, and he made one more offer, the last of its kind, in a voice that carried across the dead camp. Prison had been owed, he said. The blood was on both their ledgers. Ride south and let it end at even. For a moment, one long moment with the smoke standing straight up in the windless dawn, something old moved in Silas Calloway's face, and the two of them stood inside all the years at once, the Seep Springs, and the shared silver, and the winters at Aguirre Wells. And it almost turned. Then the ledger tipped, the way it always tipped, and the avalanche came down. Silas drew on the half-word, treacherous to the very last, and his shot burned along Jake's ribs even as the answer crossed the 30 paces the other way. A single report, and the chief of the Calloway gang sat down slowly in the churned red dirt, with an expression less of pain than of arithmetic. A man checking a sum and finding, at the end of all his years of accounting, that it had never balanced and never could. He was dead before the smoke of the two shots finished, braiding together, above the camp. Jake stood over him a long while, bleeding, with Sarah's hand arriving in his, and said the only eulogy the morning would support. "I am not that man anymore," he said quietly, to the body, to the desert, to himself. But for her, I remembered how to be. He took the little folding photograph gently from the dead man's pocket, and they walked out of the Perdita canyons together into the risen sun. They came into Redemption Creek 2 days later, at a walk, double on a rescued horse like something out of an older story, and the town that had watched him ride out as a revealed criminal poured into the street to receive them as if the church bell itself could not decide between alarm and celebration, and finally chose celebration. The county marshals arrived the following week to find the Calloway matter concluded, took depositions, looked hard at a decade-of-old paper with the name Coyote on it, and then looked at Sheriff Dawson, who had spent that week rediscovering his spine in small installments, and now performed the one genuinely graceful act of his tenure. He could locate, he said, no active warrants for any man of that description, and the wanted posters in his files had been lost, regrettably, in a small fire. Nobody in Redemption Creek ever asked about the fire. Half the town had watched him feed the stove. They were married 4 days before Christmas, in the church with the St. Louis bell, by a preacher who chose for his text the parable of the prodigal, which made the bride laugh out loud in front of everyone. Elias Whitmore gave his daughter away and wept like a mercantile that had finally, at long last, balanced its books, and the dress showed no boot print at all, because the women of the town had worked on it in shifts, all week, like a barn raising made of silk. At sundown, the two of them drove the buckboard home up the valley through the cottonwoods, man and wife. The last of it is small, the way true endings are. In the spring, Jake dug a hole under the big cottonwood by the creek and buried the long wooden box, guns and gray coat together, deep, and this time he did not nail the memory down under any floor he lived on, but gave it honestly to the ground, the way you bury a man you have finally forgiven. He came in at dusk and told his wife it was done, and she kissed him and said nothing at all, because it was not entirely done, and she was a practical woman. In the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser, wrapped in a piece of white silk left over from a wedding dress, one pistol slept on, cleaned and loaded, where she herself had laid it. Just in case, she told the drawer as she closed it. Just in case. Some stories out here end with the fast man dying in the street, and some end with him hanging in the county yard, and the dime novels back east never did learn to tell any other kind. But once, in the Arizona territory, in a valley where the cottonwoods grow tall, A story ended with the most dangerous man alive teaching his children to gentle horses and going gray beside a school teacher who had once burned down a bandit camp with a stew pot. And if you ever doubt that a man can be two men in one life, ride through Redemption Creek some December and listen for a bell from St. Louis ringing for a wedding. Still, if this story of the coyote and his bride held you all the way to the end, it is because some part of all of us is standing where Jake stood, between the person we were and the person somebody believes we can be. And stories like his are how the West still speaks to that. So if you believe a man can come back from the dead for love, follow the channel, because there are more true trails out of the old territory than one lifetime can ride. Leave a like to tell us you rode this one to the last mile. And down in the comments, answer the question this whole story has been asking. If your past knocked on your door tomorrow, would the people who love you stay the way Sarah stayed? Tell us. We read every answer, and we will see you on the next trail.